afternoon. According to my clock, it is straight up 12 noon, and we'd like to welcome everybody here to our I-29 dairy webinar. We'll be talking about this season's corn silage. What's it look like? Maybe a little on how it's going to feed. I believe this is the third year we're pleased to have Neal Wininger here. He's the feed and forage consultant for Dairyland Labs, and he will discuss what the analysis from this year's silage samples are telling him about the quality of the crop and what producers may be able to anticipate on how it will convert into milk in the tank. Neal grew up on a small dairy in central Wisconsin, earned his BS at Broad Air Ag at UW River Falls. He's been with Dairy Nutrition Consulting for almost 18 years and with Dairyland Labs for the last 8 years. Neal, we're tickled to have you here, and as I always say, the podium is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Fred, for the nice introduction and asking us to join you for this program today. We certainly appreciate the opportunity. And as Fred mentioned, we're going to be talking about forage quality and more so focused on corn silage quality from this year's crop. I will delve into a couple of the other common forage types that we see, of course. But well, we tested this out, Fred, and my slides would advance, but now they're not advancing for me. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, like as I mentioned, we're going to focus on corn silage quality, looking at new crop versus historical data, but then we'll dive into some alfalfa haylage data, and lastly, some alfalfa grass haylage data as well. This slide I like to show virtually every time I give this presentation because I think Dr. Bill Wisc did a really nice job, showing us where our potential energy comes from in corn silage. One of the beauties of corn silage is we're getting a pretty substantial amount of starch potentially. Obviously, there's variation in how much starch in corn silage, but on average, around 42% of the energy in corn silage comes from starch. The next energy potential in corn silage, of course, is from the fiber. And of course, a larger portion of that can come in how digestible that fiber is. So obviously a huge factor there. To a lesser extent, our energy comes from protein and fat in our corn silages, but kind of the big take-home point of this slide is most of our energy is coming from starch and NDF, and of course with that NDF, the NDF digestibility. With that, we'll go ahead and dive into this year's corn silage versus the previous 3 years data through the lab. Here on the left, we're looking at breaking out the Midwest corn silage samples, looking at 2024 crop versus the previous 3 years. And then in the middle here, I broke off the Northeast corn silages. And then lastly, Western corn silage. The reason I broke out those 3 regions is we get enough sample volumes to give us some good statistical data and comparing 1 year versus 3 years, etc. As you'll see, the moisture contents kind of across the board, we're looking at 64, 65%. So really not much change, new crop versus old crop on the moisture contents. Starch contents, however, we did see here a slight uptick in starch contents in the Midwest, about a point increase in starch. And then you go to the Northeast, you see about the same increase in starch contents there as well. And then out west, we actually saw almost a 2.5 point increase in starch. But as you'll see, traditionally, we tend to see lower starch out west versus kind of the rest of our typical regions where we're seeing samples from. Next in line here, in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours. Kind of looking at this year's versus last year's. We see a slight increase in starch digestibility, which is a good thing, right? So we want to get the most out of our starch. So a slight increase in starch digestibility, not huge, but a slight increase. Better than going around here. Here in the northeast, about the same, actually slightly down here in starch digestibility. 65 South Dakota and southwest Minnesota. There again, you'll see very similar, that I-29 corridor kind of mimicking the Midwest samples as a whole pretty closely with moisture content, starch, slight uptick versus all Midwest samples, but pretty similar. Slightly less in vitro starch digestibility. But probably the bigger player here is that NDF digestibility being a little bit lower than we would have hoped for. But I will point out with that NDFD, as we were talking before the meeting started, we were coming off of a couple of years in a row where our NDFDs were, towards the higher side. But still, obviously something to monitor as you start feeding new crop corn silage would be that NDF digestibility. Here we kind of took the data and we did some normal distributions. Here in this left row are the moisture contents, and then by region, moisture, starch, NDFD 30, and that in vitro 7-hour starch digestibility again. And again, this is kind of reiterating the data that we just shared. Is the green distribution of 2024 samples is significantly lower than the distribution of the previous 3 years NDFDs. But as you'll see, I mean, in this wide distribution, there are some highly digestible samples in the Midwest. So hopefully, like we were talking before the meeting, timing is everything sometimes, and hopefully we're over in this right side of the distribution for the new crop. But again, in general, so that's the biggest take home, is that NDFD being a little bit lower in the new crop samples here in the Midwest. I know people like to see what the BMR is doing versus conventionals. So here I broke off Midwest samples, looking at the conventional uh, samples versus the brown midrib or the known brown midrib samples through the lab. Um, Here we do see a little bit of a trend, higher moisture contents in general on the BMR samples. A little bit lower, fairly bit lower on the starch contents, about 2.5 points lower starch. But of course, with the BMRs, we tend to have higher NDF and higher NDF-D. So we see about 8 to 9 point greater NDF digestibility on the BMRs versus the conventional varieties. But again, looking at the overall BMRs, the new crop BMRs versus old crop, we did see a downtrend just like the conventionals, unfortunately. Here's a slide that I like to update every year. Obviously, an important metric again is the IVSD 7-hour or in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours. This is kind of showing our trend line. The brown line is the trend line for the average 7-hour starch digestibility. So when we typically hit the fall and we have a lot of new crop samples, obviously when they're unfermented or early fermented, um, we have a lower starch digestibility, but as those samples ferment and get a good fermentation, we tend to see, the average 7-hour more like 75 plus 75 to 80% in vitro starch digestibility. So just kind of the take home point of this slide is um, obviously the longer you can leave that corn silage ferment and soften up that starch and make it more available, the better as far as performance can go. Moving on to corn silage processing scores. Obviously, this is another important metric in assessing or looking at availability of starch is how well that kernels are processed. And again, as an industry, we're going way back to 2010 all the way to current. The trend line is making a nice, upward trend here. Back in 2010, our average corn silage processing score was just over 60, and now we're kind of knocking on the door of 70 being the average corn silage processing score. So, as an industry, we've made major gains in doing a better and better job of processing our corn silage and getting more out of that starch. Here's just a little bit different way of looking at those corn silage processing scores. So this is our normal distribution of samples from 2023 and 2024. So it's your distribution of samples, going all the way from 0 to 100, with under 50 CSPS score being an inadequate or considered inadequate processing, 50 to 70 being considered adequate, and then over 70 being optimum. And of course, as you saw that trend line, our average is almost hitting 70. So as we make this distribution go to the right, the better we're doing as an industry and better as a whole. Um, and yeah, like I say, look at the majority of these samples are in the upper 60s, lower to mid 70s, and even knocking on 80 plus. So that's a good trend for our industry. And here I'll just point out, looking at the percent of samples that are inadequate versus optimum versus adequate here, this year's crop versus the previous year's crop, we have a nice trend downward on going from 16% of samples down to only 7% of the samples being considered inadequately processed, versus optimally processed samples were at 44% versus 29. So again, a very nice trend in the processing scores throughout our regions. With that, obviously, processing and availability of our starch can influence how much starch we have in the manure. And there again, as an industry, we're improving. And so this is the distribution of samples, manure samples that are coming from dairies that we run analysis through the lab. Um, Kind of the first initial goal would be to be less than 3% fecal starch. So that's the blue area here is less than 3. And of course, the closer we get to 1 or 0, the better, because then, the less starch in the manure, the more efficiently the cows are digesting that starch. So again, as an industry, we're doing a better and better job, but obviously there's still some really high fecal starch samples through the lab. So keep that in mind when we start feeding new crop corn silage to maybe consider monitoring that manure to see how much starch is coming through in that manure of those cows, because obviously that's a huge factor on how efficient those cows are. Again, here we're pointing out new crop. We're getting into newer data points on the manure samples versus old crop. Percent of samples that are less than 3 fecal starch. Again, we're headed in the right direction here, going from 38% up to 41% of the samples are less than 3% fecal starch. So that's a good trend. And then on the flip side, we have less samples that are over 5% fecal starch versus previous data points. So another good trend for our industry, utilizing that starch from our starch sources. With that, I guess I'm pretty well finished up on corn silage and our starch talk there. I'll move along here to some alfalfa haylage data through the lab. Here, this row here is our 2024 new crop data versus the previous 3 years. Moisture, obviously very similar, new crop versus old crop. Protein on average is pretty similar as well. Unfortunately here, a bit of an uptick in the average NDF, so a little more fiber on average in our alfalfa haylages this year, which is probably not completely surprising with kind of some of that weather we had, especially early on with first crop, rainy type weather. And then here again, it influences a significantly lower NDF digestibility. So we're about 2 points down on our NDFDs on average on alfalfa haylage this year versus previous 3-year data. And again, inverse to that, looking at the UNDF or undigestible NDF at 240 hours, we have an upward trend, some more indigestible fiber, about 1.2 points higher UNDF on average. Ash contents, I like to follow ash in a lot of these crops that are, put on a windrow and have the opportunity to introduce soil contamination. We have a slight downturn in the ash, that's a good thing. And I think as an industry as a whole, we continue to be more cognizant of doing a better job in trying to eliminate as much soil contamination as possible. So in general there, the ash is trending the right way, downwards. And then lastly here, some of our indexes that we look at on alfalfa, RFV, obviously with the NDF and fiber trending up, we have a downward trend on our RFVs of about 4 points down from previous historical data. And then RFQ, which takes into consideration the fiber digestibility, we're about 7 points down versus historical data. Here I took that alfalfa haylage data and broke it off deeper here with Midwest versus Northeast and versus West. And again, the Midwest data is, I was going to break off the I-29 samples, but in looking at it, it was very similar to what I saw in the corn silage, where the I-29 samples mimicked the Midwest as a whole data very, very closely. So as you see, the crude proteins across all of these regions stayed pretty similar, new crop versus old crop. But here again, NDFDs, we see this downturn of 48 down to about 46.5 in the Midwest on our NDFDs. In the Northeast, they saw even larger downturn, but last year they had an exceptionally higher year. So on average, the Northeast was pretty similar to the Midwest. I will point out here out west, though, they had a pretty nice year putting up alfalfa. And I think part of that is it's heavily biased to some very nice alfalfa growing regions out west. And they had a very nice year, especially they had a lot of late alfalfa put up as well into October, even November out west. Um, so as you'll see there, then we see those numbers reflect in our RFVs and our RFQs. Again, in the Midwest, a downturn of about 4 points of RFV and about 8 points downwards on our RFQs. But again, out west, we actually saw improvement in RFV and a little bit on RFQ. And here we're just kind of reiterating that in our normal distribution of samples, the green distribution being the new crop versus the previous 3 years. Again, here we see the big take home point is our NDFDs are slightly down in the Midwest versus the previous 3 years. But as I'll point out, I mean, obviously there still are some highly digestible samples. So, hopefully more of our later crop samples we can blend those with maybe some of the earlier crop if that was where our poor digestibility came in as far as that goes. And again, here's the West samples where we actually saw improvement in that NDFD. Moving along to lastly, gonna delve into the grass legume mixed haylage division. There we saw about 13,000 samples new crop. And looking at, the new crop versus the previous 3 years data, moisture stayed pretty similar. Unfortunately, seeing here about a 1.5 downturn on our crude proteins. I think that's probably twofold why we see that. Number one, a lot of that rain early on. I do wonder about, increased maturity of the grasses, especially in first crop, with delayed harvest, etc. And then maybe some leaching of nitrogen or nitrogen availability potentially. So downturn on protein, and then we see a pretty significant uptick on our fiber levels on those grass mixes, almost 3 points or a little over 3 points greater NDF contents this year versus previous 3 years. NDFD though, we do see a slight increase in NDFD on the grass mixed area. I think the reason for that is this is probably a little heavier biased towards the grasses. So the grasses kind of outweighing our negativity of the alfalfas losing digestibility. We do see that slight uptick in NDFD on the mixed haylage area. Lastly, again, to the indexes on our mixed haylages, unfortunately, almost 12 points down on our average RFVs. And there again, about 12 points down in our RFQs because of those higher fiber levels. Here I kind of broke off where we have significant samples of mixed haylages from the Midwest and Northeast. Again, kind of this reiterates the data I just shared, the protein on average dropping from almost 20 down to 18.1. NDFD here in the Midwest, pretty similar, 51.5, 51.8. But then our RFV and RFQ numbers taking a significant drop in the upper Midwest. And again, the I-29 samples very much mimic what we see in all Midwest samples, which the I-29 samples would be included in that data there. But then out in the Northeast, they actually saw a slight uptick in crude protein. But again, this is going from a pretty low, they saw a lower year last year. I think they had excessive rains that affected their quality on a lot of these grasses last year. And again, the RFEs and RFQs, they actually saw a downtick there as well. And here lastly, showing the normal distribution then for the Midwest and Northeast samples. And as you see, probably the biggest thing here is, again, this NDF content. The previous 3-year data versus the new crop data kind of headed the wrong direction with higher NDF contents and lower crude protein contents in our Midwest samples. So with that, I guess that's kind of all that I have for slides, but we are certainly open to any questions that you all may have.
Okay. We've got a question in the chat box from Jim. What might be the cause for the low samples on the right side of one of your slides? Jim, can you kind of clear that up for me?
Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
One of the early slides, the one where it went across months, I think it was one of the really keep going, one before that. Oh, one passed. Nope. Well, one with all the scatter plot there. See on the right side there, several months in, even though the average down toward the bottom, there's all of those samples that are those, would they have came across all the way across that, or would they be unprocessed? What would cause so many low samples during those couple months period of time? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so those would more than likely be fresh samples, unfermented. So this is
Oh,
basically a scatter plot over time, but
right.
so we do end up getting fresh corn silage. This is probably midsummer where we get some fresh corn
Okay.
silage coming from further south.
Okay.
So it's almost certainly fresh corn silage. So all of these data points, down in that 45 to 55 range, yeah, those are most likely going to be new crops starting to come in again. But obviously that trend line over time, we got a higher percentage up in that 70 to 85 area that are fermented probably close to a year. Yep.
Okay,
But
that makes
very
sense.
good question. Thank you.
As we were looking at the starch differences, are those going to be weather caused? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of factors. A lot of factors there. Yeah, weather. It does seem like the last couple of years, it seems like you hear more cases where the cob, we had a fall that plants seemed to stay green, but yet the cob was maturing and the cob was ahead of the plant, so that would tend to play into that. But yeah, certainly weather, a lot of factors, of course, but it does seem like I heard more of that and saw more of that where the cob was ahead of the plant. I don't know if that's kind of what you all were seeing out there as well.
Yeah, when I talked with producers, that's exactly what I was hearing, but I thought, well, maybe that's just unique to this area.
No, I think that was fairly common across a lot of the upper Midwest. Yeah, with the plants staying greener and the cob getting ahead of the rest of the plant.
We're
Ye-
We've got kind of a smaller group. If folks don't want to type and they just want to go ahead and unmute and ask a question, they sure can do that. Jim, you've got another question there?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Neal, can you use this and can you accurately predict milk production across the whole US with all these samples you get? Milk per cow, are we going to be up or down?
Well, I mean, yeah, but I I mean, yeah, we probably could, but I don't know the utility being that, obviously there's a lot of factors that go into that, right? Where
No,
I
I agree.
feel like nutritionists and their dairy customers do a much better job of you know, tailoring the diets, tailoring things on farm to account for these changes year to year. Um, so, I didn't mean to paint the picture where, it's this 5 point loss in NDFD. Yeah, to me, that's not the end of the world. We're still feeding high corn silage diets, and obviously that impacts the total diet when you have a 5 point drop. But as nutritionists and dairies, we can make some changes to those diets to account for that and try to offset our loss in digestibility from the corn silage. Um, so, yep.
As we were looking at the slide where you were talking about the kernel processing, the ones that are doing well and the ones we'd like to see do better, what's the next step for corn silage processing? Is there going to be a top end?
Well, I think as we keep on moving forward, I think we're going to keep on pushing more of these samples that are less than 50 up into the 50 to 70, and more of these 50 to 70 samples are going to push into that 70 to 90. And I think it's, multiple reasons. I mean, obviously our dairy producers are doing a better and better job of if they're processing the corn silage, they're doing a better job. But of course, if they're working with custom harvesters, they're pushing the custom harvesters to do a better and better job. And of course, our equipment companies are coming out with better and better processors. So I think there's, many reasons for the industry improvements. And yeah, I would expect that to continue to improve with our awareness as an industry to make sure we're processing our corn silage adequately. And obviously we probably need to do that because we don't want starch in the manure. We don't want to waste carbon. We don't want to waste carbohydrates. So the more efficient we process our corn silage, the more efficiently we can get that energy out of that starch. So,
I look back 15 years ago and think about what we were doing with kernel processors. Yeah, we've seen some changes and improvements in the machinery, but my question, I really think that the dairymen are insisting that the operators are better. They've slowed down a tick. They've really got, those kernels beat up the way they're
right.
supposed to be. I don't,
Yep.
Jim, are you seeing that out in the field too?
I think so. I think I think the nutritionists and the farmers are kind of riding these custom processors that are doing it. As Neal said, the processors have gotten better. There's more choppers with processors on. So I think, we've just learned a lot over the last decade or so about processing, and we've got all these tools now and measurements that we can take. So I think and I think that's one of the reasons we get so much milk out of our cows with these high components, because we can just measure and fine tune those diets. And Neal said I was being a little facetious about my comment about milk production, but it is unbelievable how we can fine tune those diets. Milk changes some, but boy, it's amazing what we can do.
Right.
I was talking with Dr. Thomas, and I was bemoaning some of the grass silage in our area. And he made a point I hadn't thought of, where he said, not all grass silage is brome or timothy. As you test these, are you seeing some changes in the grasses that are coming into the lab?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's we still see, obviously grass can be a huge range of what grass can be, right? So
Right.
you brought up brome or, well, historically, probably more of the grass and grass silage was probably fed to beef, where you wanted it probably more so mature versus our dairy clientele are getting some of these newer grass varieties, whether that's fescue, festolium, um, some of the later maturing grasses to go along with legumes. So yeah, we see some pretty highly digestible grasses as a whole, and then too, seeing more small grain silage harvested, whether that's, a winter cover crop that's harvested for silage, um, or whether they do, some other system of producing small grain silage. So, and there again, small grain silage can cover a pretty wide range of what it is, fiber contents and fiber digestibility. But in general, there's some pretty good small grain silage harvested as well.
If we have anyone else with a question, they can either type it into the chat box or just unmute and ask it directly. I'll give just a few seconds to see if a question comes in. Not hearing any. I've got one last question, Neal. We'd talked before the program started that we'd had a question come in about an alternative feed. In this case, it was a soybean isolate. Tell us what you all can test for in your lab.
Well, so on a product like that, certainly the overall crude protein, um, which would be a fairly common analyses for something like that. Obviously, it's very high in protein, so a crude protein, but we could also run amino acid analysis if you felt like the amino acid profile may be a little different than typical soy protein. So yeah, certainly doing an amino acid profile may be a viable thing to do through the laboratory to make sure that you get the proper amino acid profile going into balancing. I would anticipate, I suppose, the fat content would be very, very minimal on something like that, wouldn't it? But
More
certainly
than, yeah,
yeah,
more than likely it is.
yeah. So I
Well,
guess I would think the crude protein and then amino acid profile would be the top two that I would think about, but certainly protein digestibility as well. We could do, like a two-step digestion process to come up with the estimation of total tract protein digestibility as well.
very good. I'd like to remind the listeners that we do record these programs and they will be on the I-29 MU University website. Give us 3 or 4 days and it should be up. In addition, I've included the location, as well as a very short survey that we use to kind of figure out if our programming needs a tweak here or there. So definitely encourage people to go ahead and take a minute and fill that evaluation out. Any closing comments you want to share with the producers who are listening?
Well, I guess I'll just, like I say, I don't want to come across that this, lower NDF digestibility is, the end of the world or anything. Certainly, we need to be cognizant of that and monitor that with new crop samples and when we make diet changes. And like I say, the nutritionists and dairies do a very good job in general in making those type of changes to try to account for that. Certainly depends on how much of that forage is being fed as well, and how much flexibility you have in those diets. But yeah, just a general awareness of that's kind of what we're seeing through the lab thus far, is that downward trend in NDFD, but hopefully y'all have the ability to make some change and make up for that and go from there.
Very good. Neal, we appreciate what you've shared with us today, and would invite folks to go back to the archived and listen again if there are some things they needed clarification on. I'd like to remind folks that this is a monthly program, and in the beginning of next week on December 10th, we've got a scanning the forage future for 2025 with a good group of presenters, and there'll be a lot of time for questions. And then for those of you who are obviously got cattle either on feed or in the milk barn, we're going to be talking about extra label drug use in cattle and how aspirin fits in on Thursday, December 19th. So again, Neal, thank you very much for the presentation. And folks, we will look forward to having you back with us at some point in the future.
Thank you.